In this lecture, we will study East Asian civilizations by examining the early history of China and India. When looking at China, you will be introduced to the Shang Dynasty, China's earliest recording civilization. Then we will look at the Zhu Dynasty. This section on China will conclude with an overview of the I Ching, known in English as the Book of Changes. In the following section, two key texts from ancient India will be surveyed, the Vedas and the Upanishads. Finally, we will close this chapter with the Indian philosopher Uddalaka, who lived during the 800s BC. The Shang Dynasty. Some historians maintain that the Shang Dynasty, was 1600 to 1045 BC, was not the first Chinese dynasty. Despite convincing archaeological and literary evidence, these scholars propose that China's first dynasty, a period of time when a powerful family reigns over a kingdom, was the Xia dynasty, spelled Xia. The Xia dynasty supposedly lasted from 2070 to 1600 BC. Around 1600 BC, the Shang dynasty rose to power. Concrete evidence of this dynasty are the oracle bones mentioned in the previous chapter. When these bones were discovered in the 1800s, they were mistaken for magical dragon bones and ground up for medication. Eventually, scholars found out about these bones and started translating the ancient characters etched into them. Their translations provided significant information about the Shang dynasty. Much warfare occurred during the Shang dynasty. As a result, military weapons and tactics developed. One example is the Shang use of horse-drawn chariots around 1200 BC. The Shang dynasty not only defended their centrally unified dynasty with military might, but also strove to bring about unity through ritual practices. Two principal practices they sanctioned were fortune-telling and ancestor worship. Shang kings participated directly in these two rituals as priests who, they claimed, were capable of communicating with the dead. The main god of this time that the Shang kings worshipped was named Shang Di, meaning Lord on High. According to myth, Shang Di lived in a heavenly city called Shang, along with Shang ancestors. Sacrifices, including human sacrifices, were offered up to Shang Di and other lesser gods. 17th century Jesuit missionaries, in an attempt of inculturation, proposed to the Chinese that Shang Di, in his true essence, is the god of Christianity. The Chinese worship of Shang Di, further claimed Jesuits, had over time become distorted. Both Dominicans and Franciscans protested the Jesuits' attempted Christian use of the name Shang Di and the Jesuits' tolerance of Chinese Catholics honoring their dead. In 1645, Pope Innocent X decreed that the Chinese rites promoted by the Jesuits were not to be used. Below is an excerpt from the True Meaning of the Lord of Heaven by the Jesuit priest and servant of God, Mario Ricci, whose beatification is currently being considered by Rome. And this is what Mario Ricci wrote. He who is called the Lord of Heaven in my humble country is he who is called Shang Ti, or Shang Di, in Chinese. He is not, however, the same as the carved image of the Taoist Jade Emperor, who is described as a supreme lord on the black pavilions of heaven, for he was no more than a recluse on Wutung Mountain. Since he was a man, how could he have been the sovereign of heaven and earth? If we go to fortune-telling, which will be the second form of ritual practices encouraged by the Shang dynasty to bring people together, and these modern forms of fortune-telling are traceable to the Shang dynasty, including palm reading, face reading, shaking bamboo sticks, astrology, use of grass stalks and coins, numerology, and use of revered books. We now move on to the Zhu Dynasty, Z-H-O-U. The Western Jiu Dynasty, 1045 to 770 BC, replaced the Shang Dynasty after the last Shang Ting king was defeated by the Zhu king Wu in the battle Muye in 1045 BC. It is called Western since its rulers lived in the western portion of China. When replacing the Shang Dynasty, the Zhu promoted themselves as morally superior to the supposedly immoral rule of the Shang. Out of this narrative developed a theory of kings that is similar but different to the Western idea of the divine right of kings. The Eastern counterpart is called the Mandate of Heaven. According to the Mandate of Heaven, as explained in poetry from the Zhu period contained in the Book of Odes, the gods in heaven punished the corrupt Shang by allowing the upright Zhu to defeat them in battle and replace their rule. The belief that rulers are to live upright lives, and if not, the gods will punish them, influenced Chinese politics through all its dynasties until the final Qing Dynasty, which lasted from 1644 and ended in 1912. The Mandate of Heaven was repeatedly appealed to in order to explain the fall of one dynasty and the legitimacy of its successor. Due to a feud between the Western Jiu King Yu and a powerful Eastern ruler who is the father of the King Yu's wife, the Western Jiu Dynasty fell in 770 BC. King Yu had enraged the Eastern ruler by dismissing his daughter, whom he was married to, and replacing her with a concubine. In the beginning of the Eastern Jiu Dynasty, the capital shifted eastward, hence the name Eastern Jiu Dynasty. And the Eastern Jiu Dynasty lasted from 770 to 256 BC. This dynasty was divided into the Spring and Autumn period, 722 to 481 BC, and the Warring State periods, 480 to 256 BC. During these two periods, the Zhou kingdom fragmented into many warring states. Much bloodshed occurred during these frequent wars. Gradually, one warring kingdom, the Qin state, emerged as the dominant power, and in 256 BC overthrew the last Zhou king. The I Ching. The I Ching, known in English as the Book of Changes, was written around 680 BC during the Eastern Jiu Dynasty. This book detailed a divination system consisting of lines, some which are broken, that increasingly replace the use of oracle bones. Under the great philosopher Confucius, and Confucius lived from 551 to 479 BC, the I Ching was chosen to be one of the 5 foundational books called the 5 Classics, consisting of the I Ching, the collection of poetry to the gods and ancestors called the Book of Odes, the book of documents of Zhou rulers and officials, the Book of Rites, and a book that chronicles history named the Spring and Autumn Annals. The Vedas. We will now shift our attention away from China to another very ancient Eastern civilization, India. As with China, India has a set of foundational writings that greatly shaped its civilization. One such work is the Vedas, written in Sanskrit, a language that is related to the European languages. This collection is the oldest writings from India. It consists of theology, philosophy, laws, including religious rituals and poetry. For the Hindus, the 4 books of the Vedas are their most sacred texts. A central recurring theme in the Vedas that is key to understanding much of Indian thought is the caste system. A caste system hierarchically orders people. For example, in many Western countries, how much money a person has or earns defines his social status. In contrast, the Indian caste system was understood as hereditary, according to which people are born into a certain social class, whose rights differ from classes above or below it. The Indian hierarchy is defined not by wealth, but by purity, understood spiritually as reflected in and through the physical world. In accordance with caste system purity rules, strictly observant Hindus do not marry nor eat with anyone outside of their caste. According to the Rig Veda, the caste system first began when the first man killed himself. Out of his body, various human groups were formed. The Brahmins, the highest class, were formed from his head, the Kshatriyas from his hands, the Vaishyas from his thighs, and the Sudras from his feet. The Upanishads. The Upanishads, written between 900 to 500 BC, are the parts of the Vedas that deal specifically with philosophy, spirituality, and prayer. Key topics they discuss include, according to their Sanskrit names, samsara, karma, dharma, moksha, atman, and Brahman. In Sanskrit, samsara means gliding through. It is used in reference to souls that, according to Brahmanism and Hinduism, are reincarnated in different life forms. Karma means fate and deeds. In the Upanishads, it means justice that is cosmically determined by bad deeds and good deeds. Dharma translates into English as correct or right in the sense of right action. Moksha refers to liberation from the cycle of reincarnation. Atman in English signifies the soul or the essence of the individual, while the term Brahman signifies the universal soul or ultimate reality that permeates and sustains all that exists. The following excerpt is a central teaching of the Upanishads. In this passage, the individual soul is identified with the Brahman. This means that whatever distinctions we think exist between individuals and that which sustains all in existence is an illusion. Even the various Brahman gods are but an illusion of the one Brahman reality that all are part of. The doctrine taught here is monism. Monism maintains that ultimately no distinction between individuals exists since all fundamentally is one reality. The key to be freed from the recurring cycles of samsara, where individuals transmigrate from one life form to another, is to let go of desire. When this occurs, the individual then realizes that all is one and becomes merged in the Brahman. According to Catholicism, even when experiencing the highest stages of mysticism, we do not lose our identity as we draw closer to God. Instead, we become more ourselves in accordance with our true identity, that, even though related, always remains distinct from others and from our Creator. Our relationship with God, consequently, is never absent from desire, as Benedict XVI states in his encyclical Deus Caritas Est, God is love. Here, the Holy Father defines desirous love, eros, as ascending, possessive love from human beings to God, and descending love, agape, as that which comes down to us from God. These loves, Benedict XVI writes, can never be completely separated. In explaining this, he writes, "The more the two in their different aspects find a proper unity in the one reality of love, the more the true nature of love in general is realized. Even if eros is at first mainly covetous and ascending, a fascination for the great promise of happiness, and drawing nearer to the other, it is less and less concerned with itself, increasingly seeks the happiness of the other, is concerned more and more with the beloved, bestows itself and wants to be there for the other. The element of agape thus enters into this love, for otherwise eros is impoverished and even loses its own nature. On the other hand, man cannot live by ablative descending love alone. He cannot always give, he must also receive. Anyone who wishes to give love must also receive love as a gift. Certainly, as the Lord tells us, one can become a source from which rivers of living waters flow. Yet to become such a source, one must constantly drink anew from the original source, which is Jesus Christ, from whose purest heart flows the love of God. In the account of Jacob's ladder, the fathers of the church saw this inseparable connection between ascending and descending love, between eros, which seeks God, and agape, which passes on the gift received, symbolized in various ways. In that biblical passage, we read how the patriarch Jacob saw in a dream, above the stone which was his pillow, a ladder reaching up to heaven, on which the angels of God were ascending and descending. A particularly striking interpretation of this vision is presented by Pope Gregory the Great in his Pastoral Rule. He tells us that the good pastor must be rooted in contemplation. Only in this way will he be able to take upon himself the needs of others and make them his own. St. Gregory speaks in this context of St. Paul, who was borne aloft to the most exalted mysteries of God, and hence, having descended once more, he was able to become all things to all men. He also points out to the example of Moses, who entered the tabernacle time and again, remaining in dialogue with God, so that when he emerged he could be at the service of his people. Within the tent he is borne aloft through contemplation, while without he is completely engaged in helping those who suffer." End of quote. Compare Benedict XVI Catholic explanation of self, God, love, and desire with the following excerpt from the Upanishads. That self, Atman, is indeed Brahman, as well as identified with the intellect, the manas, and the vital force, with the eyes and ears, with earth, water, air, and the ether, with fire, and what is other than fire, with desire and the absence of desire, with anger and the absence of anger, with righteousness and unrighteousness, with everything identified as is well known, with this what is perceived, and with that what is inferred. As it does and acts, so it becomes. That self which thus transmigrates, reincarnates, is indeed Brahman, the supreme self that is beyond being identified with righteousness and unrighteousness. It becomes identified with everything. Everything is the effect of righteousness and unrighteousness. Whatever is differentiated is the result of these two. The self, on attaining it, becomes identified with that. In short, identified as is well known, i.e. with objects that are perceived, and therefore with that. Upanishad says, he who longs for object desire, making much of thee, is born along with those desires in places where he will realize them. Therefore, the self is identified with the desire alone. Thus does the man who desires transmigrates. But the man who does not desire never transmigrates. Of him who is without desires, who is free from desires, the objects of whose desires have been attained, to whom all objects of desire are but the self, the organs do not depart. Being Brahman, he is merged in Brahman. Uddalaka. Uddalaka, lived in 800 BC, was a famous Upanishad sage. In the account of the banyan fruit, he vividly represents monistic doctrine. His teaching that individual identity is an illusion is contained in this short story, The Self as Nothing. Bring me a fruit of the banyan tree. Here it is, venerable sir. Break it. It is broken, venerable sir. What do you see there? These seeds, exceedingly small. Break one of these, my son. It is broken, venerable sir. What do you see there? Nothing at all, venerable sir. The father then said, that subtle essence, my dear, which you do not perceive there, from that very essence this great Nyagrodha arises. Believe me, my dear. Now that which is the subtle essence, in it all that exists has itself. That is the true, that is the self, that thou art, Svetkat Ketu. Please, venerable sir, give me further instructions, said the son. So be it, my dear, the father replied. God bless.